The BookTube, it's Roz. I've been a bit absent for a couple of weeks. I needed a little rest after October. So to ease myself back in, I'm going to do a tag. And this is the nonfiction journey tag, which was created by Hannah of Hannah's Books, and she kindly tagged me. And she drew on the Shakespeare hosts Shakespeare journey tag and the Victorian literature tag for Victober that I and Tilly made, drawing on to. So we're on to the sort of like the third iteration, I guess, of this journey tag related to 3 different monthly readathons. Do it if you fancy it. Prompt number 1, and it's broadly the same questions. Okay, so prompt number 1: what was your first experience reading non-fiction? I think it was probably Ladybird non-fiction books. If you were British and you grew up in the 60s and 70s, you will know what I'm talking about. Little books about this big, really well illustrated, quite simple language, but lots of them were on non-fiction topics. You know, the Ladybird book of, I don't know, British kings and queens, or the Ladybird book of mammals, or, you know, yeah. I had a lot of those and enjoyed them. I also had older works of non-fiction for children. Here's one that I loved as a child. I think it was published somewhere around 1900. It's an Edwardian book of about nature, aimed at children. Look, full of lovely illustrations, both engravings and colour plates, and it used little stories about a couple of children sort of going out on nature walks, and then built in the facts to follow up. Wonderful. My mother used to read that with me, and that I also loved as a child books with maps, and I'm just going to share one with you. This came out in 1978, so I was 14 at the time, so it's not the first non-fiction I was reading, but a good example of something that I loved. And it's the Times Atlas of World History, and it's that the big picture and making connections between things I really enjoyed. There we go. Question number 2 is, has the reading of a work of non-fiction ever brought you to tears? Yes. I think non-fiction can almost bring up stronger emotions in me than fiction, because you know it's real. So it's, when it's sad, it's more sad in a way. I don't know. A good example, Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain. That's her memoir of World War I and the period just after, and her experiences, and when she wrote about the young men that she knew that died in the trenches and so on. It's I remember tears streaming down my face. A more recent example would be Sema Yazbek's A Woman in the Crossfire, which she wrote about the early months of being part of the early months of the Syrian Revolution. Yeah, so distressing to read. And, that's just a couple of examples. I think it's interesting, really, because when I was growing up, I think in my mind, and I think perhaps culturally, there was kind of a feeling that non-fiction should be a bit dispassionate, that it might be writing about, I don't know, events or ideas or arguments or theory, that were sort of might have emotions attached, but it should be written in a way that I don't know, steered clear of that. I mean, a memoir could be witty or outrageous, and a biography might be admiring or debunking, or be someone writing about travel or art could be enthusiastic, but there's generally a feeling of it should be just slightly reserved. Is that just an English thing, British thing? I don't know. I think that shifted somewhere, maybe in the 1970s. I don't know. You think of Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring, where she was writing from a huge personal passion about the impact of pesticides and herbicides on nature and so on. But yet, if you read it, she writes it in a way that sort of keeps that very strong emotion that she obviously felt kind of slightly under wraps, and gives us sort of a scientific, calm, dispassionate overlay. It's almost a feeling that what you wrote might be devalued if you put too much emotion into it. And I think that has changed now. So if you're like Rebecca Skloot writing The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, you want to get the science and the history right, but you feel you can allow yourself, I suppose, to show your outrage a bit more clearly. I suppose polemic has always sort of done that a bit. Let's think of something like James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. A book like that. He writes it in that kind of I don't know, again, a kind of trying to give, almost an obligation to do like a calm and reasoned argument. But the fire is there and you feel it, and you feel the outrage and the anger and that emotion comes through. 1963, I think this came out. So, yeah, maybe a shift. Yeah, and some of the feminist writers of the 70s, I remember when I read The Female Unit by Germaine Greer. I mean, she's become completely off the planet lately, but reading that, I felt that, viscerally, I suppose. Well, I better move on. Are there people, this is problem number 3, who've played a significant role in your non-fiction journey? Yes, I'd say my family, by having interesting non-fiction books around the house, by giving me child-friendly non-fiction books when I was a child and, encouraging me to read them. But I think that I got slightly turned off non-fiction when I was a student, or by the experience of studying, at degree level and beyond, almost took some of the joy away from non-fiction for me. I didn't want to read non-fiction for fun, because if I had to read it for academic reasons. And so I'm really glad that I've come back to loving non-fiction as a pleasure for the general reader. And I think I should thank my husband Steve for helping me make that rediscovery, because of the kinds of things that he read and sometimes would have pushed under my nose. Prompt number 4, do you enjoy documentaries? Do you have a favourite? And is there a subject you'd like to see discussed on film? Yes, of course I love documentaries. Doesn't everyone? Yeah, no, maybe not. I think I was lucky to grow up in a bit of a golden age of the documentary on television, the documentary series. Things like Kenneth Clarke's Civilization, say. I mean, I know it's dated now and it was very Eurocentric, but wonderful TV to watch as a child. And all of the, the David Attenborough Life on Earth series and everything that's followed on, really, as I say, a bit of a golden age. And that's carried on to today, I think. And in my enthusiasm, favourites, I mean, the things I love are where you get the combination of an expert who's also enthusiastic with some brilliant photography, or filming choices. So someone like Mary Beard, making series about Pompeii, say, or living with the Romans or whatever. So so enjoyable. Watching someone like Waldemar Januszek talking about art. His series about the Baroque made me realise that a type of art that I'd looked down on as in my sort of teens and 20s, that how glorious and wonderful it could be. Andrew Graham Dix can do that for me too. Janina Ramirez can interest me in things that or people that I didn't know that I might love. And currently, David Olusoga would be my sort of number one documentary fave. There you go. Because of what he's doing with sort of writing about Black history and all just different takes on British and imperial and colonial history. Fresh perspective is always welcome. What would I like to see discussed on film? I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because almost the best for me is a documentary about something that I don't know that I want to know about. Good example would be Wild Wild Country, which came out in 2018, and it's 6-episode documentary about a cult about what were they called? Well, it was Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, the Rajneeshis, the orange people, and their community in Oregon, and how would I have known that I would be fascinated by 6-hour-long episodes about that? But I was. So I can't say what I would like next. I just know I'll know it when I see it. Question number 5. Have you read a biography or memoir of a person with whom you identify? Now, this is really difficult because I think, I want to avoid hubris. Okay, so I tend to read biographies and memoirs by people that I admire or I'm interested in, people that are more talented than I could ever be, who've had more adventurous lives than I'm ever going to have, so, the kind of person, biography I love. I'll have Patrick Leigh Fermor, who walked across Europe and then, those sorts of things. Well, I'm not going to compare myself, with those people. But what I would say is that I do identify with a kind of non-fiction writing that is about being alert and appreciative about the world. Books about walking and just paying attention to what's around you. Books by some people like Robert Macfarlane, for example, the way and where, I don't know, people that are interested in the world, in nature, in people, in history, in society, that make those connections and okay, those are the kind of non-fiction writers perhaps that I identify with, because I hope that I approach the world in a similar way, at least some of the time. Which brings me to Nan Shepherd and The Living Mountain. So the next prompt number 6, is to read a bit from a non-fiction book that you love. And this book, The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd, is a book about the Cairngorm Mountains and Plateau in Scotland, small area. It's a small book that's like a jewel of a book that she almost didn't imagine was going to get published, but it wasn't published till years after she wrote it. And yet we're so lucky to have it. And it's the kind of writing that, yes, I do identify with without imagining that I could write in this way. Let me give you just a little tiny bit. Okay. She's talking about being up on the high bit of the Cairngorm Plateau and what she's seeing and hearing. Okay. The sound of all this moving water is as integral to the mountain as pollen to the flower. One hears it without listening, as one breathes without thinking. But to a listening ear, the sound disintegrates into many different notes: the slow slap of a lock, the high clear trill of a rivulet, the roar of spate. On one short stretch of burn, the ear may distinguish a dozen different notes at once. I could go on and on, but lovely. There we go. Prompt number 7. Do any works of non-fiction intimidate you? Which and why? Well, there are things that don't particularly attract me. I mean, if I read them, I might be surprised by how interesting I'd find them. But, I don't read celebrity memoirs, really, no interest. But that's because, I don't really care about them. But every now and then someone tells me, oh, actually, you should, because it's actually really well written. But they're not where I want to spend my time. But they don't intimidate me. What intimidates me? Very, very long books, I have to admit. So a really good example would be Red Comet, The Life of Sylvia Plath. I've forgotten the name of the writer, but yeah, she wrote it a couple of years ago. Big book in reputation, but it's well over 1,000 pages. Yeah, definitely intimidates me. I'm not going there. The other thing that intimidates me, I think, is I really enjoy reading kind of popular science-y books. Love that book. Oh, name of it's gone out of my head. It'll come back to me. I'll put it in the notes. Book about fungi. Yeah, that sort of thing. Lap it up. Adam Rutherford writing about genetics. Delighted to read that. Love nature, but and biology and those sorts of things. But I'm intimidated by books that I think draw on a scientific literacy that I think I don't have. So things that are more about, geography, social science, all fine. Physics, I worry that I'm not going to have the building blocks to appreciate a book, even if it's kind of relatively popular science. There we go. Prompt number 8, what tips would you give to people hesitant to read nonfiction? Well, the obvious tip is to say read about people and things that interest you. But actually, I'm going to say I think sometimes actually the style and quality of the writing matters more than the subject matter. So you can read a boring book about something you're interested in, whereas you can have a wonderful, fascinating, engaging time reading about something that you didn't know you'd be interested in, or a person that you've never heard of. I loved Bad Blood by Lorna Sage, memoir. Now she's a poet. I hadn't read any of her poetry, but I just really enjoyed the way she wrote about growing up and her life. Other examples, Natalie Haynes, I can, love what she writes about the Greek myths. Now, that's a subject that I enjoy, but you can have dull books about it, or books that are just fun, and hers are fun while still being knowledgeable. I mentioned Janina Ramirez before. She can write about Julian of Norwich and make me think, I really love this woman. I'm fascinated by her life. Why would I be interested in a sort of medieval mystic? So, Fever Pitch, by what's his name? Nicholas Hornby. Memoir about football. Delightful, but even to non-football lovers, I think. So, yes, listen out for good recommendations, pick a writer who can really write, and that, I think, maybe matters more than the subject matter, maybe. And that might draw you in. Also, don't ignore graphic nonfiction. You won't read a better memoir than Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, for example, or Genderqueer by Maya Kababe. That's one I read recently and loved. So yes, be open to possibilities, and also don't be afraid to abandon something if it turns out to not be good. There you go. Question number 9, what are your favourite works of nonfiction? Well, there's too many. And interestingly, I think with fiction, I'm quite loyal to certain favourites, whereas in nonfiction, my favourite is probably, one that I read last week. I read An Immense World by Ed Young. Absolutely loved it, about animal senses, changed how I see the world, so currently that's my favourite. I mean, all the books that I've been talking about in this video are favourites. I'm going to pick out one that I think helped get me back into reading nonfiction other than memoir, and that's Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond. It's probably a little out of date now. It was written in 1997. It's one of those sort of broad brush books that engages your mind but is very readable. Another recent one would be The Invention of Nature by, is it Andrea Wolf? Writing about, oh, goodness me. I have this word finding trouble sometimes, and particularly recently when I've just had COVID again. Really famous 18th century naturalist and explorer, Humboldt. There we go. It came back to me. Really enjoyable book. So many I could talk about. Oral history. I wouldn't have thought that I would get great pleasure from that. But I love Chernobyl Prayer by Svetlana Alexievich. Really engaged me. So, many favourites. Now, tagging people quickly, Ros, because you're coming up to 20 minutes. I'm going to tag anyone who's interested, but I'm specifically going to tag Gemma of Books, Heidi of My Reading Life, Oliver, The Chaotic Bibliophile, Elizabeth of Bouquins and Books, David of David Novak Reads Poetry, because he doesn't only read poetry, Angelia of Read and Reread, Alba of Seriella, Greg of Another Bibliophile Reads, Alan Bickhole Butcher Classics, and Mark of Book Time with Elvis. There we go. But anyone else who fancies it. And do tell me about your favourite non-fiction books if you're not going to make a video because you're a commenter, but you've got a magic one to share.